January 1942. The English coast lies drowned in darkness. A salt wind claws through the cliffs near Dover, howling across radar towers and steel bunkers that stand like silent sentinels facing the black expanse of the channel. Inside one of those bunkers, a handful of men huddle around a glowing green screen, the only light in the room flickering against their pale, sleepless faces. The hum of machinery fills the air, a low, constant vibration that feels almost alive. Sergeant Howard wipes frost from the corner of the cathode display and squints at a faint line that shouldn't be there. For a moment, he thinks it's just noise, a ghost signal caused by the weather. Then it moves steady, deliberate, heading straight toward England. He calls for the officer on duty. Within seconds, the room comes alive with tension. Radios crackle. Telephones buzz. A red light begins to blink above the door, the signal for an incoming raid. Outside, spotlights swivel toward the sea. Anti-aircraft gunners brace their hands on cold metal rails. Somewhere in the distance, the first sirens begin to wail. And then silence. The men wait. The radar trace continues forward. No sound of engines, no glimmer of wings, only that green pulse crawling toward them through the dark. The officer's hand trembles as he leans in. "How far out?" he asks quietly. 70 miles, closing fast. They ready their defenses before anyone can even hear the enemy coming. Minutes later, the night erupts in light. Flak bursts blossom across the clouds, blinding flashes cutting through the fog. Searchlights catch the silver bellies of bombers no one had seen with their eyes. The first wave of explosions shakes the coast, but the defenses are ready. What should have been a surprise attack becomes a massacre. The Luftwaffe's formation breaks apart before reaching the shore. When the echo fades, the radar operators stand motionless. They've seen something impossible. For the first time in the war, Britain had seen the enemy before the enemy saw them. The commanding officer looks at the radar console, a crude, patched-together contraption with a nameplate that doesn't belong to any official manufacturer. In small stamped letters, it reads, E. Blake Instruments, Dorset. The name means nothing to them, but it soon will. Because the device that just saved hundreds of lives wasn't designed by a scientist, or a general, or even a soldier. It was built by a farmer. Across the country, far from the frozen cliffs and coastal stations, Dorset's fields lie quiet beneath a heavy fog. It's winter now, the soil too hard to till, the hedgerows glistening with frost. The barns creak in the wind, and the smell of damp hay hangs in the air. To anyone passing by, there's nothing remarkable about this place. Just another farm struggling through wartime shortages. But to those who would later study history, this patch of land hides the beginning of a revolution. Beneath the rafters of an old timber barn, a network of copper wires stretches like a spider's web. In the corner sits a battered table covered in radio parts, coils, and pencil sketches scrawled across feed sacks. This is where Edwin Blake, a quiet man with calloused hands and a mind that never stopped working, once listened to the sky. Few ever knew his name, yet his fingerprints are etched into the very pulse of modern radar. Back in 1941, when the country was burning and hope was wearing thin, Edwin had sent a letter, just one, to the War Office. Inside were pages of hand-drawn circuits, annotated equations, and a strange claim. Aircraft can be detected at range by reflected electromagnetic echoes, even through darkness or fog. The letter might have ended up in a waste bin, as so many eccentric inventions did, if not for one man, Major Charles Renner of the RAF's Experimental Division. Renner had seen wild ideas before, but something in Blake's notes caught his attention. The precision of the math. The agricultural analogies describing wave interference as seed scatter. It was madness, but intelligent madness. Weeks later, Renner arrived in Dorset unannounced. The neighbors thought the military came to arrest the farmer for sabotage. Instead, they found him in the barn, knee-deep in mud and metal, tuning a humming contraption that looked more like a milk separator than a scientific instrument. At first glance, it was absurd. Buckets, tractor tubing, and copper coils mounted on plow handles. Yet as Blake turned a dial, the air filled with a faint, pulsing tone. He told them to wait, to listen. The officers stood in skeptical silence until the machine's needle twitched, once, twice, and then stayed steady. Moments later, the distant sound of engines rolled across the valley. A formation of German bombers was passing overhead, invisible in the night sky, but the machine had already sensed them. That single moment changed everything. Within weeks, Blake vanished from Dorset. Officially, the farm was requisitioned for wartime use. Unofficially, he was escorted to a place that didn't exist on any map, Bawdsey Manor, the coastal laboratory where Britain's most secret research into radio detection was underway. No one in the village saw him again, but rumors spread. Some said he'd been arrested for witchcraft. Others claimed the Germans had taken him. Only his wife knew the truth, and even she wasn't allowed to speak it aloud. Back in Dover, as the radar operators smoke in silence after the night's attack, the officer in charge stares again at the crude nameplate on the device. He doesn't yet know that the man behind it was a farmer. He doesn't know that Blake's designs had been laughed at by scientists months earlier. All he knows is that something about this setup works better than anything they've tested before. He leans over the console, listening to the rhythmic hum echoing through the wires, a sound almost like breathing. Outside, dawn begins to creep over the horizon. The sea glows faintly silver, littered with the wrecks of downed aircraft. The men who survived that night will never forget the eerie calm before the first blip appeared on the radar, the moment the sky spoke back. And somewhere, miles inland, in a locked research compound, Edwin Blake is awake, staring through the glass of a laboratory window, watching the same dawn rise over the English fields. He doesn't know that his creation has just proven itself in combat for the first time. He only knows that the signal worked, and that the war has changed forever. But while the world celebrated a new invisible weapon, no one asked how a farmer with no access to classified technology had beaten Britain's best scientists to the idea. The answer lay buried in his past, in the quiet isolation of a Dorset barn, and in the secrets he kept from everyone who ever tried to help him. Autumn 1941. Fog blankets Dorset like a shroud. Each morning, Edwin Blake pushes open the warped barn doors before the sun has climbed the hedgerows. The hinges groan, echoing across the silent fields. Inside, the smell of hay and oil mixes with cold earth. His breath curls in the air as he pulls a heavy wool coat tighter around his shoulders. The harvest has failed again. Rations are thin. The war feels far away, yet its shadow lies heavy on every British heart. To the villagers, he is only a farmer. Mud on his boots, worry lines carved deep into his face, and a 1,000-yard stare of someone who has known too many winters of loss. They wave politely when passing, but no one stays long enough for conversation. There are whispers that he was once a clever man, something to do with radios before the Depression broke him. Now they say, he tinkers in the barn at night, muttering to himself among broken tractor parts. But what no one sees are the sketches scattered across the workbench, loops, coils, and frequencies. Each drawing filled with frantic notations, arrows, and numbers. His hands tremble slightly as he adjusts a dial on an old radio chassis, the faint crackle of static breaking the silence. The sound comforts him, a reminder that even in isolation, the world still speaks. It had started by accident months earlier. He was fixing a neighbor's radio one evening when a strange thing happened. As a plane passed overhead, the static shifted, not random, but rhythmic. A pulse, faint yet deliberate. He waited for another aircraft days later, and again the static danced in the same pattern. While others saw coincidence, Blake saw a message. The air itself, he realized, could tell when something moved through it. He began experimenting. Copper wire salvaged from broken fences. Tractor batteries wired into bread tins. Wooden plow handles became antenna mounts. He wrote equations on feed sacks and painted measurements across the barn wall. At night, while his wife slept, he adjusted knobs and watched the needle on his voltmeter tremble. When the signal rose, he marked it down with the precision of a scientist and the faith of a man chasing ghosts. Outside, the world was collapsing. News from London spoke of raids that flattened entire streets. Children were being evacuated to the countryside. In those quiet Dorset fields, the distant rumble of bombers sometimes reached the hills, faint, hollow thunder from another world. Each time he heard it, he promised himself he would find a way for Britain to see them coming. His wife begged him to stop. "It isn't right, Edwin," she said. "People are talking. They think you've gone mad." He said nothing, only adjusted another coil and scribbled another note. Madness, perhaps. But every genius sounds insane until history catches up. Through September and October, he refined his contraption. A set of copper wires strung from the barn rafters to a tractor axle outside acted as a crude antenna. He noticed reflections when birds flew near, stronger when metal passed overhead. The pattern repeated so consistently that doubt itself became foolish. He was no longer guessing. He was measuring. The invisible waves of the world were revealing themselves. But how to prove it? He wrote a letter to the War Office addressed simply, "For the attention of His Majesty's Government, Department of Technical Development." In careful handwriting, he explained his theory, that by transmitting and receiving pulses, one might detect distant aircraft even in darkness or fog. He attached diagrams, hand-drawn and uneven, but brilliant in their logic. He signed it humbly, E. Blake, farmer, Dorset. Then he waited. Weeks passed. Nothing came. Until one December night, headlights pierced the fog outside the farmhouse. 2 military vehicles stopped near the gate. Men in long trench coats stepped out, boots crunching frost. His wife watched from the window as they approached the barn. She feared the worst. Perhaps Edwin's experiments had interfered with army radio channels. But when they knocked, they were polite, almost curious. Inside, the officers found a mess of farm tools and electrical clutter. At the center, a large table with a humming device powered by tractor batteries. One of the officers, Major Charles Renner, smirked. "So this is the miracle machine?" Edwin didn't answer. He turned a knob slowly, and the low hum deepened into a rhythmic pulse. The room seemed to breathe with it. The needle on his gauge flickered. "There," he whispered. "Listen." At first, there was only static, then a faint tremor in the ground. The officers exchanged glances. Within minutes, the distant growl of engines drifted through the night, bombers flying toward the coast. The device had sensed them before human ears could. Renner's expression changed from amusement to awe. The other officer whispered, "Good Lord, he's actually done it." By dawn, orders came from London. The farm was to be classified. Blake and his device were to be transported under military escort. His wife was told her husband had been called to serve his country in a technical capacity. The barn was sealed. Within a day, the farmer vanished from Dorset. For Edwin, the transition from muddy fields to a coastal fortress was dizzying. He was taken to Bodsey Manor, a research station hidden among windswept dunes, guarded by barbed wire and silence. There, Britain's brightest scientists were refining something called RDF, radio direction finding. They worked in secrecy, chasing the same dream that Blake had discovered alone in a barn. At first, they treated him as an outsider. His accent was rural, his clothes too plain. They laughed at his crude methods, plow parts and feed tins instead of precision instruments. But when they saw the data, the laughter faded. His crude setup produced clearer echoes than their polished prototypes. He explained resonance in the language of soil and seasons. "The air has its own harvest," he said. "You just need to listen for the seeds returning." Renner became his advocate, convinced the farmer's intuition had stumbled upon principles their formulas couldn't yet describe. Soon, technicians began copying his circuits. The military re-engineered them into compact radar units, deploying them along the coast. Britain's eyes were opening, but success brought unease. Blake began asking questions about what his technology would become, who it might kill. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man who listened to signals. The idea that his invention might guide bombers to destroy cities gnawed at him. Still, he worked on, knowing that silence was no defense against war. By Christmas 1941, radar coverage stretched from Scotland to Cornwall. Night raids were intercepted before reaching major targets. Newspapers celebrated the unseen watchers of the skies, though no one outside the research stations knew how those W.H'ers saw. And in one of those stations, a farmer sat alone, staring at the green glow of a cathode tube, realizing that the waves he once traced in a Dorset barn now guarded an entire nation. But as his fame grew within the shadows, so did the doubts of those around him. When engineers began questioning how his crude machine could outperform their laboratories, Major Renner made a discovery in Blake's notes that changed everything: coordinates, coded letters, and a name thought long dead. Winter 1942. The sea outside Bodsey Manor is restless, waves slamming against the shingle like a drumbeat for a war the world still cannot see. The great house looms over the coast, its windows blacked out, its hallways echoing with the hum of generators and the quiet chatter of scientists in lab coats who rarely smile. Behind the wire fences and armed guards, something extraordinary is unfolding. Inside a converted ballroom now lined with wires and cathode tubes, Edwin Blake stands at the center of it all, a man out of place. His clothes still smell faintly of soil and oil, his hands rough from years of farming. Around him, Cambridge men with perfect diction debate wavelengths and phase shifts. He listens quietly, speaking only when asked. But when he does, they stop talking. Because somehow, impossibly, the farmer's crude designs, the ones mocked as barnyard science, detect aircraft at night more accurately than the government's most advanced prototypes. His circuits are simpler, his materials primitive, yet his results cannot be ignored. Each test confirms it. His resonant feedback system sees further, faster, clearer. The senior engineers try to explain it away, a fluke, a calibration error, but Major Charles Renner knows better. He's seen this man's work predict bombers over Dover. And now, standing beneath the manor's vaulted ceilings, he sees something else in Blake's eyes. Exhaustion mixed with something heavier, guilt. Renner calls it patriotism. Blake calls it penance. Bawdsey runs on silence. Every experiment is classified. Every corridor lined with closed doors. The scientists live and work in the same rooms, sleeping on cots among their machines. Some whisper that radar, this invisible detection, could end the war. Others fear it could make war eternal. Blake works late into the nights, long after others have gone to bed. He keeps a small notebook in his coat pocket, not the standard government-issue kind, but one filled with messy handwriting, sketches, and strange notations. He uses farm language to disguise his meaning. Where others write frequencies and angles, he writes furrows and rows. Where they write reflections, he writes harvest. No one pays attention until one morning in February, when an engineer named Douglas finds the farmer asleep at his bench. The notebook lies open beside him. Douglas flips through it idly, until he sees something that freezes him in place. Coordinates. Precise ones. And not in England. He shows them to Renner, his voice low. These aren't ours. They're in Switzerland. At first, Renner thinks it's a mistake. But as he flips the pages, his stomach tightens. Frequencies, pulse intervals, and signal reflections, all carefully logged, are annotated with those same foreign coordinates. And at the bottom of the page, a name, E. Blake, followed by E.B., again in different handwriting. 2 signatures. Renner doesn't want to believe it, but the thought festers like a splinter. He remembers Blake's first letter to the War Office, oddly formal, with sections written in a different hand. He'd assumed it was his wife's. Now he isn't sure. That night, he finds Blake in the workshop alone. The farmer is tuning a new frequency oscillator built from brass fittings and recycled milk tins. The air hums faintly with static. "Edwin," Renner says softly, "these coordinates in your notes, where did they come from?" Blake doesn't look up. "You've read my notes." "I had to." "Then you already know." Renner steps closer. "Switzerland. Why there?" The farmer finally looks at him, eyes weary but steady. "Because someone needed to see what I see." The story comes out slowly, like static fading into a clear signal. Edwin Blake has a twin brother, Eric, who had left England years earlier, before the Depression. Letters had stopped in 1938. Everyone assumed he'd died somewhere in Europe when the war began. But Eric was alive, living under another name, working for the German Research Bureau. When Edwin discovered his radio anomaly, he didn't just share it with the British government. He sent fragments, coded through farming language, to his brother as well. Crop yield meant echo strength. Planting season meant frequency calibration. Harvest time meant detection range. Renner listens in silence, each word heavier than the last. "You shared radar data with Germany?" "I shared knowledge," Blake replies. "The kind that can't be buried under flags." To Renner, it sounds like betrayal. To Blake, it's something deeper. The belief that both sides chasing the same discovery might prevent one from destroying the other first. A dangerous logic. A desperate hope. Within hours, Renner files a report. Intelligence officers arrive quietly the next morning. Blake is questioned for 16 hours straight. No sleep. No food. Just voices asking the same question. "Who else have you spoken to?" He answers calmly. "Only my brother. And only once more, after I knew what it could do." They ask why. He says, because if he understood it, maybe they'd stop bombing blind. It's not the answer they want. Days turn into weeks. Blake is kept at the manor under guard, his access restricted. His invention continues to be studied by others, his name slowly erased from documentation. The scientists replicate his methods but change the terminology, rewriting his discoveries in the language of officialdom. Outside the manor, radar stations multiply. Each tower, each antenna, traces its lineage back to the crude circuits of a Dorset barn. Yet the man who built them walks the halls like a ghost. Renner tries to defend him, writes memos, pleads with the higher-ups, but the mood has shifted. War leaves no room for ambiguity. To question loyalty is to lose trust, and trust is already in short supply. One evening, Renner visits Blake in his quarters. The farmer sits by the window, staring out toward the sea. The wind howls through the cracks, carrying the faint smell of salt and oil. "They'll never let you leave," Renner says quietly. "I know. They think you're a traitor. I think they're afraid of what they can't understand." Renner hesitates. "You gave them radar, Edwin. You saved lives." Blake shakes his head. "I gave them sight. What they do with it isn't mine to control." There is no anger in his voice, only fatigue, the kind that comes from knowing you were right too soon. By mid-1944, as the war begins to turn, whispers spread that the Germans have developed their own advanced radar, remarkably similar to the British system. Some say it's coincidence. Others know better. Then one morning, Blake is gone. His quarters are empty. His notebook missing. Officially, he's transferred to another facility. Unofficially, no one ever sees him again. Renner searches for months, filing quiet inquiries that lead nowhere. Files disappear. Reports are classified beyond his clearance. It's as if Edwin Blake never existed. But the machines remain. Every Allied radar station hums with the same rhythm, the same frequency resonance that began in a barn on a fog-soaked farm. His fingerprints are everywhere, in the circuits, in the echoes that sweep the skies, in the invisible waves that protect Britain's cities. Years later, when Renner retires, he visits Dorset one last time. The Blake farm lies abandoned, roof collapsed, fences overgrown, fields reclaimed by weeds. In the ruins of the barn, he finds a single piece of copper wire hanging from a beam, swaying gently in the wind. He listens. The wind hums through it, faint, rhythmic, almost like the sound of static. And for a moment, he imagines the farmer still there, listening to the world through the noise. When peace finally returned, so did the silence. But years later, buried in a declassified archive, a single note surfaced, stamped top secret. One phrase stood out: Prototype B, origin civilian. And the hum that once spoke through Dorset's fog would echo through every radar dish the Allies ever built. The war ended the way storms do, slowly, with long rumbles fading beyond the horizon. The sirens quieted. The blackout curtains came down. Cities counted their losses in brick and memory. And on windswept headlands from Scotland to Cornwall, the towers kept turning, their bowls and booms tracing patient circles across a peace they had helped to buy. At night, when the sea lay black and the stars were clear, those dishes still hummed, soft, regular, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. To most, the sound was nothing more than machinery settling into routine. To a few, it was the last living echo of a secret that had never quite found a home. In a reading room that smelled of paper and dust, Major Charles Renner turned a page in a declassified file and saw a phrase that caught in his throat. Prototype B, origin civilian. Someone had underlined it years before, the pencil line faint now, as if ashamed of its own certainty. There was no name appended, no citation, only a technical diagram whose imperfect curves felt strangely familiar, hand-drawn, as if sketched on a feed sack in the half-light of a barn. Renner closed his eyes and heard the old hum again. The farmer's hum. The Dorset hum. He could trace the arc of the war through the language of radar alone. Chain-home towers, rough and towering, watching the daylight. AIMK, forfeited to night fighters, hunting in the black. H2S mapping cities in ghostly contours. The cavity magnetron shrinking miracles into boxes one could hold in two hands. The lexicon of victory, grim and clinical. Each leap forward had worn the stamp of a laboratory, a bureau, a ministry. But in the driftwood of those official words, Renner could still feel the grain of something older and simpler. Wires strung between rafters, coils wound on plow handles, a man with soil under his nails listening for patterns in the static. He looked up from the file to the window. London was bright again. Buses grumbled past. Someone laughed in the corridor. And in that ordinary noise he heard the quietest question one can ask of history. What happens to the person when his work becomes a machine? The record showed nothing. After 1944, Edwin Blake was a hole, a blank space carefully penciled over. Transfer orders with no destination. A requisition form that ended midline. The file trail went cold in a cabinet that smelled of damp cardboard and obligation. No medals. No citations. Not even a post-war address. As if the war had swallowed him whole and chosen not to spit him back. Renner folded the file and signed the ledger. He felt older than his years. When he stepped into the daylight, he did not look back. Far to the north, beyond the last railway towns and the last hedgerows, a coastal station still took its readings. The operators had changed uniforms, but not the job. Flicker, sweep, flicker. On the cathode screen, a commercial flight arced toward the continent, a dotted line composed of pulses too brief to be called anything but a heartbeat. In the rack to the left, a maintenance panel carried a scrawl in pencil. Do not retune, sweet spot here. It had been there for years, rewritten with each repaint, treated less like a note and more like a superstition. No one knew who had first scrawled it. No one questioned it. Every time a technician drifted off spec, the old advice proved itself true. The sweet spot had a number, like everything else. It also had a story, like almost nothing else. If you asked the oldest hand in the room, he'd tell you a rumor passed down through crews like a song, about a prototype that had understood the night better than anything that came after. About a farmer whose machine didn't just detect, it listened. About a man who'd taught the sky to answer. Most rumors are wrong. This one was only incomplete. In Dorset, the farmhouse no longer stood. Wind had emptied it. The hedges had pulled in tight, reclaiming the ground the war had borrowed. But if you knew where to look, you could still find the anchoring bolt in the soil where a length of copper had once been tied off and tensioned against a tractor axle. If you put your ear near the earth on a gusty day, you could hear a faint, taut whine rise and fall as the wind moved through the weeds. It was not radio, not really. It was the sound of memory insisting that it had once been something else. Renner came there once, years after the file. He stood in the doorway that used to be a barn door and tried to assemble ghosts from light and dust. He could see Edwin in nearly everything. The care taken with a knot, the patient logic of a workbench scarred by 1,000 tiny tests, the chalk line on an old beam where a coil had been nailed and lifted and nailed again. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Eric had truly existed in the way the reports suggested, or whether the story of a twin had been the farmer's last kindness, a way to pull suspicion off the men now building his machines. Letters had been intercepted. Coordinates had pointed to Switzerland. Signals had moved across borders in the oldest language of all, family. The facts were there. Their meaning was unsettled. The war had taught Renner to live with unsettled things. It had not taught him how to forgive them. He took a few steps into the long grass and felt something catch his shoe. A thin twist of copper wire, green with age, curled like a question mark. He coiled it loosely in his palm and put it in his pocket without knowing why. Time, as always, did what time does. Radar left the cliffs and found new homes. In airports and weather stations, on fishing boats and cargo ships, in the noses of airliners carving quiet lines through night. The pulse became a tool, then an expectation, then an invisibility. The world slept beneath umbrellas of detection, so complete that most forgot to look up. In university lecture halls, professors taught the history as it ought to be taught: principle, experiment, breakthrough, deployment. It was a clean story, all steps and arrows, the rough edges sanded smooth by progress. Somewhere, a footnote mentioned civilian contributions, as if a village were a small library of ideas one could simply check out and return on the due date. But every few years, a graduate student would follow a footnote into a basement archive and find a diagram whose angles weren't quite metric, whose notes had been written by a hand that did not care for margins. Resonance like a plow in furrow. Return like grain thrown and gathered. The metaphors did not belong to the seminar room. They belonged to weather, to seasons, to failure and persistence. The student would look up from the page and understand, if only for a moment, that the map of discovery is not a straight line but a field walked until the feet know where the ground rises. Those who truly study machines know. Every clean instrument has a dirty ancestor. Every polished dial has a splintered prototype. Every acronym hides a name. And what of Edwin Blake? There are versions. In one, he is given a new identity and a quiet house in a western town, where the hills keep their secrets and the hedgerows lean in to listen. In another, he boards a freighter under an assumed name and disembarks where no one asks questions of men who keep their heads down and their hands busy. In a darker telling, he does not leave the coast at all. He walks down a corridor whose doors do not open from the inside and vanishes into paperwork that never needs to be refiled. Renner kept none of those versions. He kept only the wire. He retired to a cottage where the night was dark enough to see the Milky Way in winter. Some evenings, he would tune a shortwave set and listen to the sky, The way one listens for the voice of a friend believed dead, but only ever out of reach. Signals rose and faded, scattered by weather and chance. Once late, a pattern flickered on the meter, steady, patient, unmistakable. He leaned close, held his breath, and smiled despite himself. The room was empty. It did not matter. The room hummed as if someone else were there, adjusting a dial he could no longer see. History loves endings. War does not. The machines turn. The screens glow. Commercial flights sketch silver arcs over oceans that once swallowed fire. On a headland where wind chews at old concrete, a technician checks a cabinet and touches, without quite thinking, the spot where a pencil note was once written, "Sweet spot here." He doesn't know why the phrase survives. He only knows that it works. In the end, what remains is simple. A farmer listened longer than anyone expected. He heard the world answer. He shared what he heard, and the answer became a shield. Whether he shared too widely or just in time is a question the living will argue until the wires themselves go quiet. For now, the dishes keep their watch. The night breathes. Somewhere, a radio crackles softly in an empty barn that isn't there anymore, and a needle twitches before any ear can catch the change. The sky speaks back. It always has. He simply taught us to hear it.